Hello everyone and welcome back to my office. This is week 5 of your COM 350 summer session, and that means we only have 3 weeks, 6, 7, and 8 coming up starting next week. That means for you I need to do a couple of things. One, I need to finish grading your first papers and of course your exams, which I'm working on. Second, I need to give you the instructions for your second paper. I recorded a video last year that I think is the best description for what I want from you on this paper. So I am going to post that video as well as this one. And in it, I talk about exactly how to structure your paper, the 5 parts of it, and the options that I'm providing to you. The reason I provide those options is because we haven't gotten through enough rhetorical criticism methods in a summer course. We just can't. To get you through the second paper without telling you about it sooner rather than later. So I'm going to go ahead and do that only because I want you to have the opportunity to have as much time as possible for paper 2. It's worth a lot of points. So any questions that you have, I'm going to tell you to email, text, whatever. If I don't respond to your email, again, text me. That's the best way to ensure that I could go in and look for that email that I either missed or that is in a bulk folder or in a junk folder. There's a lot of folders that it could end up in. So, and yes, Missouri State University addresses sometimes end up in there. I don't know why. It's been that way since I came here in 2006, so I'm not going to try to change it now. I'm just going to tell us to be aware of that. So, it's 4th of July week, and I don't think I'm doing anything for the holiday, but I respect that you may be. So even though I'll record a video on Thursday for you as usual, I don't expect that you all will sit down on July 4th and do anything with this class. And, you know, I give it to you so that you can watch these videos at your convenience. Hopefully you don't put this off until the weekend, because I imagine that you may have plans, even if some of us don't. And if you're wondering why I don't, it has nothing to do with what's going on in the world politically. It's just that this year we've had so much go on that I was like, I need a break. So we are not joining our family for the 4th of July. Anyway, that said, it has been a rough, I don't know, decade, but more importantly, a rough couple of days. Excuse me, goodness, a rough couple of days for those of us who study political communication, and you know that I do. And it's been a rough time for democracy. You know, no matter what side of the political fence you're on, I think we all know that this is not about the democratic principles set forth in the Constitution. Why do I bring that up in this class? Well, I bring it up because there is such a relationship between the centralized power of a totalitarian regime or an authoritarian regime and and rhetoric, and how that need becomes irrelevant. And then also, of course, because in a democracy there is that decentralized power and the need for rhetoric is great. I can't think of a time when the need for understanding all the means of persuasion coming out of the mouths of people, including our leaders, is more important than right now. And again, I'm not saying which way to go with that. I'm just saying we need to understand all the means of persuasion in every instance when everyone is speaking, be they president, former president. Okay? So I just want to make you aware that for the first time in my history, I can honestly say this stuff applies. Okay? Now, it's not going to sound like it today, just so you know, because I'm going to be talking to you about 3 theorists today. I'm going to talk to you about Ramus, Peter Ramus, Francis Bacon, and also I'll be talking to you about Vico. So those are the 3 I'm going to cover. There's 5 on this week, and these are the 3 I'm going to start with because that's the order we're going in, so it makes the most sense. As we come out of the medieval period and the understanding of rhetoric that it is for the church, The Roman Catholic Church is in charge of everything. The empire, the feudal system, monarchies develop, and that form of government does not lend itself to needing to understand several things. One of those things is science. One of those things is rhetoric. One of those things is the politics of what's going on in the court, unless you're a princess, as we heard from Christine de Pizan, or a prince. Those things aren't important at the moment, which means reading isn't important, writing is not important, and public speaking isn't really all that important, okay? So what happens between the medieval period and where we're about to go? And a lot of it has to do with a couple of things that are going on, not just in Europe, but all over the world, which is the Renaissances. And these Renaissances were really about bringing the aesthetic to our practices, our teaching, and that's arts, okay? And the arts did in fact include being able to speak eloquently. And so as we move through the Renaissances and we're getting to the Enlightenment, as we move through these Renaissances and we're getting to the Enlightenment, there's a sort of a peaking interest in something called humanism. Some people believe that humanism means that humans are placed above God. Others will say, no, that's not what humanism means. Humanism just means that there is a way for humans to find the truth that has nothing to do with the Bible and God and the church. Now, obviously, this was heresy, right? I mean, you should not be saying those things if you belong to the church. So, as we learned with Augustine, you have to be very, very careful about how you address the issues of rhetoric and its link to science. Now, I'm putting that in air quotes for just a moment because I want you to understand that during this time period, the word science and the word reason pretty much meant the same thing, okay? So when people were talking about proof, they were talking not just about scientific proof, but also logical proof, which we know that Aristotle was doing. But they couch it instead in this sort of battle between the church and human existence. Which is not something that lasted very long, but it's something that influenced our way of thinking. And science, reasoning, is important to public argument, as you know. Now, when you're doing public speaking at this time, it was for aesthetic reasons or for the church, right? So what are we talking about this relationship with reason and science for? Well, we're talking about it because people started to realize that the way that we teach each other about topics of truth is through, like, the Socratic method, through discussion, through public presentation. And all of a sudden, rhetoric becomes incredibly important. In fact, it's going to be called the rhetoric of science. And we still study this, by the way. We study how it is that scientific information is spread, or I have to say misinformation or disinformation at this point. How that is spread through the practice of rhetoric in the public sphere. And that's where we're at. So let's introduce ourselves to the first person to separate rhetoric from reason. His name is Peter Ramus, R-A-M-U-S, Ramus, or if you read the French, I can't read French, but if you did, it would be, I believe it's Petra Rami, okay, is how it's pronounced. Anyway, you don't need to know that. That's a little tidbit for trivia. Ramus really apparently wanted to be the chair, what they call the chair, or what you might consider to be a director or a department head. He wanted to be the chair of philosophy. And at the time, He was well known for a piece he had written. That is the piece that you are skimming through. And I tell you to skim it because you're going to be able to get the idea of it very quickly, but also because I tend to talk about this piece a lot. Peter Ramus says that God gave us two gifts. So notice the attention to recognizing the church and God as sort of highlighted or raised or above all else. But he says that God gave us two gifts, and one of those gifts is the power of speech, and one of those gifts is the power to reason. Okay, so he says here that God gave us the gifts to speak and to reason. So it's okay for us to do those things because they are God-given gifts. Humans can speak, humans can reason, and therefore we should be able to use those. How do those two things come together? Well, you know that in reading, all of the classical Greeks, all the classical Romans, and even Augustine, in a way, those two things come together in the practice of rhetoric, right? Well, Ramus says, I don't want to do that. That is crazy. First of all, Aristotle's idea of a syllogism, stupid. And in fact, Ramus writes a syllogism to prove that Aristotle is bad at syllogisms, and his syllogism is just flawed. It's a flawed syllogism, even when he's trying to critique Aristotle, which is kind of funny and fascinating. He calls who was it? Was it Plato, maybe? He calls on Plato to say that he had the right idea, that rhetoric was bad, or that rhetoric was only for the presentation of public speaking. And he called Quintilian out because Quintilian's definition of rhetoric included the following: it is a good person speaking well. And Ramus really takes issue with this because he says, no, rhetoric is speaking well. That we can all agree on, but it has nothing to do with the ethics and character of the person. Now, for those of you paying attention, you might realize that this is a great departure from Aristotle, Cicero, Quintilian, when they said that the character of the speaker, the source of the speech, has to be a good person in order for them to practice rhetoric. Otherwise, you're just lying, or you're just giving a speech that doesn't have any good reasoning behind it. So for Aristotle, for everybody else except for Ramus, we have these 5 canons of rhetoric that include ethos, pathos, and logos, right? In the invention part. So ethos, the character or the ethics of a person, or as I told you, the notion of goodwill towards your audience, is brought up here by Ramus. He says that is extraneous. And he critiques Quintilian for sort of being overbroad in his definition of rhetoric, or of a perfect orator, if you want to look at it that way. He says this art of speaking can't have anything to do with the character of the person. That's just silly. And by the way, also, Cicero said you should know everything about your topic, and Quintilian shares this idea. That's nutty. That's just nutty. You can't know everything about everything, which I agree with Ramus on. I'll give him that one tiny point. So Ramus decided to rectify this problem by doing the following. He took the 5 canons of rhetoric and he said, let's divide these into the 2 separate gifts that God gave us. God gave us the gift of speech, and God gave us the gift of reason. Therefore, in the gift of speech, the only canons of rhetoric that apply are style and delivery. And some people say memory as well. That's questionable, but it depends on which edited version you read from Ramus. I'm okay with it being in either one, honestly. I'm going to go with style and delivery because those are easy to explain, that they are in fact part of speech, right? They are how we deliver a message. Has nothing to do with the message itself. On the other side of this, reason, that's where the other three come in. That's where invention, arrangement, and memory come in, is in the reasoning era. Now, so we have this divided idea of the canons of rhetoric. You can imagine how people felt that this was so radical at the time, because rhetoric, the practice of it, had always been taught as a practice of learning, of knowing, of finding the truth. Okay? So that was always a part of rhetoric, and now Ramus says, nope, those are separated. Now, Peter Ramus was not popular. He didn't get the chairship that he wanted. He was run out of town on rails, pretty much. And I believe that he was, quote, torn apart during the battle, or the St. Bartholomew's Massacre. That's the one. So, very disturbing that we would throw out somebody like that in such a violent way. I'm not sure who did that or why. But for some people, it was just too much to take. That at the time, one of the 5 core teachings the seven liberal arts, the 7 core teachings in education included rhetoric. Okay, so why would you take that core teaching, that core idea, and rip it apart into 2 things that are completely separate from each other, and saying that they're separate from each other, when the job of rhetoric is to link reason and speech? So rhetoric takes on a change in trajectory. There is suddenly a giant split in the timeline that we're about to study. Because with what Ramus did, making rhetoric, that is to say speech, which he refers to as rhetoric, only the aesthetic, only the speaking and delivering style. That's it. By doing that, he removes all of the philosophical responsibility that a rhetorician has to understand all the means of persuasion that are happening. And he puts that into science and reason. So now rhetoric and reason are separate. That's what he did. And that really messed us up. How did that mess us up? Well, I don't know if you've ever heard about the study of elocution. We'll get to that here eventually. Or heard about the practice in forensics, the exercise of analyzing things through public speech. I don't know if you've ever heard about the concept of debate in high school and college. All of these, I'm sure you have, all of these things, all of these practices are part of the division from Ramus. That's why people say to me all the time, why do you teach lying? Why do you teach fake news? Because supposedly rhetoric still has the reputation for just being empty, flowery language, of just being style and delivery, as Ramus said. And I was reading your assignments. As you know, I graded the what is rhetoric thing. So I know what you came into this with, and some of you did come in with this idea that that's what rhetoric is. And you know what? If you leave this class and you still think that's what rhetoric is, I'm cool with it. I'm used to it. I've lived with it for a long time. So Peter Ramus divides everyone's thinking on rhetoric. We have those who believe that rhetoric is related to reason, that reason is part of rhetoric, and we have those who say that rhetoric is a practiced art, that it is speaking, that it is delivery and style, and nothing more. Here's how Ramus says that we should think about it. there are several different arts and skills. If you see a painter, let's say an oil painter, you see an oil painter and you evaluate his work based on the signifiers of good poetry, that won't work, because the painter does not write poetry. The painter paints. And if you try to evaluate a poem the same way you would evaluate a painting, that's problematic. Now, here's where I disagree with Ramus, because while it may be that the visual of the art of the painting is different from the feeling that I get, or from the writing of the poem, the feelings that they engender are not different ways of feeling. I might feel that this is good and this is bad, or this makes me happy and this makes me sad, but the one thing I'm not doing is evaluating from the art and from the poem how it gets to me. Okay? And he says, so therefore, because art has a different set of standards, poetry has a different set of standards, architecture has a different set of standards, and so on, that we can't evaluate them the same way. Now, when you think about that, you're like, okay, if you're a painter like I am, you're like, yeah, I can't write poetry, I can't draw a building or do interior design. I can't do those things. But I think when people look at my paintings, that's not what they're thinking about. But that's where, for Ramus, the aesthetic lives. So now we have people who will come along that we're about to talk about, who believe that rhetoric is reasoning. And it has to be. It has to include all 5 canons. It can't be separated out. So during this time period, remember how I said during the Greek period we had this battle between rhetoric and like philosophy? And then during the Romans, it was about the relationship between rhetoric and power. And during the medieval period, it's about rhetoric versus the church. So now what is rhetoric in competition with? What is it facing? 2 things. Science/reason, that's one, and the aesthetic. And somehow rhetoric is separate from those 2. And we have people who debate within themselves, like writing scholarly works, that argue that rhetoric is just empty, flowery language intended to be beautiful, and those who say rhetoric is a practice that requires us to understand reason and science. So that's how we're going to split off in the timeline over the course of the next several weeks. And I will be sure to identify for you which way everyone is going. So that moves us on to Bacon and Vico. And I put these 2 together only because Vico addresses Bacon, but they weren't really like hanging out, having coffee and talking. But Vico and Bacon have something in common, and that is that they are talking about rhetoric and its role in reasoning. So these 2 are going to talk about the role of rhetoric in reasoning. And by the end of the week, we are going to study the role of rhetoric in the aesthetic. Okay, so that's sort of how I'm dividing this up. So Bacon comes along, and he is somewhat of a humanist. He does not address the subject of religion or God or the Bible. He instead is a scientist. If you've never heard of Bacon, let me give you a couple of pieces of information. First of all, a piece of trivia. His mother's maiden name was Cook. So his full name was actually Sir Francis Cook Bacon, which I think is just awesome, because who doesn't love bacon? He's often mixed up with a different Francis Bacon. And I know nothing of that Francis Bacon, but there is another famous Francis Bacon who also wrote in philosophy. So we are talking about Sir Francis Bacon. He was his life was like a roller coaster. He was either really rich and on the high, or really low and dirt poor and in prison for it. So there's really these differences for him that go up and down and up and down. I've given you two pieces of works, different works. They're fairly short. And in the first one, he addresses the psychological side of rhetoric as a skill. Okay, he actually looks into his study of the brain, and he invents or creates or finds or discovers or whatever you want to call it, a way of doing science. And that way of doing science was inductive. The idea that you would go out and have multiple experiences and then bring it back and be able to draw conclusions from it. Now, that might sound somewhat familiar to you, right? Because the scientific method is the deductive version of Baconian method, okay? In the scientific method that we use now, we posit some sort of conclusion, and then we go out and find little experiences to find out if they apply. And if they apply in enough cases, then we say that the hypothesis is proven true or that it's not. Okay? So the Baconian method of scientific inquiry was a thing. And I would argue it's still a thing, but it's something that we word differently. Because you come at the reasoning from two different places. The Baconian method is inductive, the scientific method is deductive, and that's the one that we use today. But the Baconian method, being inductive, meant that he also wanted to know how it is that the brain might be able to process different things that we do. So he looked at the brain as having separate, different parts to it. Now, you might have heard the term faculty psychology before, and a lot of people think that has to do with your faculty at school. It does not. It has to do with each area of the brain focuses or has a different faculty in it. A faculty for math, a faculty for music, a faculty for science, a faculty for speaking, rhetoric, a faculty for philosophy, okay? And that we are born with brains that have these different faculties. Now, when I was a kid, we used to actually say things every day, like, I don't have the faculty for that, meaning my brain does not do that. Most of the time, it's math. If you ask me, what book made me cry that I read in high school, the answer would be my algebra and calculus books, okay, and my trig book. Those are the books that made me cry. I can't do math to save my life. I don't know why. My husband went into engineering. He clearly can do math. I cannot. I don't have the faculty for math. And he thought that rhetoric was a faculty that you could have or not have. And that's why he says it can't be split up and divided like Ramus wants us to, because it's a part of the brain. It's a faculty in the brain that you either have or don't have to be able to reason and communicate that reasoning. Okay, how does that look? We need to look no further, and I hope it's okay with me using this example, than the presidential debate the other night. Now, I'm sure that if you didn't watch it, you've seen TikToks, you've heard reviews, it's everywhere, we can't escape it, and rightfully so, by the way. What did we have? In my opinion, we had a charismatic person who did not reason well and said things without any evidence or reasoning behind them. But he spoke it in a way that people were attracted to it. And that was Donald Trump. Is he a great rhetorician? No. Was he a good speaker? I mean, comparatively, we all are, right? Comparatively to Joe Biden that night, we're all fantastic speakers. We're charismatic and we're awesome. So yes, but he's not I would not say that's a good practice of rhetoric because of the goodwill, because of the reasoning and science part. That you have to have evidence to make arguments, that you have to be able to reason from that evidence, that you have to be able to not just shout out claims and conclusions, but to actually put something behind them. And he really failed at that. But a lot of people won't recognize that because they see a charismatic speaker. All right, and that's understandable. That's human nature, honestly. And then you have the other guy. The other guy is up there saying, here are the bills I passed, here's the plan I have, here are the things that are accomplished. Unemployment's at a 50-year all-time low. Yes, inflation is high, but that's part of a working economy that's recovering from COVID, from the pandemic. No other democracy in the world recovered as fast, and this is all evidence that you can fact check, right? With Donald Trump, you could fact check it, and you're going to see that there's a lot of things he said that just don't have any evidentiary support anywhere, okay? So Joe Biden's delivery was dreadful and difficult to get through. A lot of my scholarly friends were turning off their TVs going, I cannot watch this anymore. I forced myself to watch the whole thing. And in here what we have is a speaker with a great grasp of invention, of the evidence and the reasoning from that evidence. He just couldn't communicate it. So you tell me, what does rhetoric require? And I'm going to tell you, we need both. We need the charismatic speaker with style and delivery that people enjoy listening to and can understand, a person who can communicate ideas. And we also need a person who is going to tell us the truth about facts and reasoning those facts out to come to conclusions about whatever it is that they're speaking about. We need both. And so that night I was totally like, oh my God, what do I do with this? I have no idea. If I was an undecided independent voter, I'd be like, what the hell? I already said neither. So anyway, that debate, while difficult to watch and difficult to see, and if you didn't see any part of it, go look at a little clip of Donald Trump and a little clip of Joe Biden, and you'll see what I'm talking about. It's a great display of what happens when Ramus's division of the 5 canons occurs. And Bacon says that can't happen because it's a faculty in your brain. You may have heard that people have said it, and there's debate about whether this is true or not. I happen to think it is because I do it. Whenever you're telling the truth, but you're trying to remember, you look with your eyes up and to the right. So if I'm trying to remember something, I'm like, well, here's what happened. Okay? If you are lying, you have to be creative. I think I have these right. You have to be a creative. So you have to make it up. So you look to the left, you're like, well, the left and up. Why? Short-term memory is here. You've got your creative side here. And that's where your eyes go as if you're looking for your memory or your answer. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. So a little bit of what Bacon gave us, we still use today, especially when we're trying to decipher truth and untruth in speeches, in jury selection, and so on. Okay? So Bacon then writes a piece that seems like it's actually in response to Vico, but he writes this piece called Novum Organum. Novum Organum is the Latin for new instrument. Okay? Novum Organum means new instrument. And what he does here is he says, yes, we have all these ideas for things that we can use in science. We've got, at the time, I think I could say with fairness that they had telescopes. that drew distance into us much more closely. We were looking at the stars. We were trying to tell time different, like from the sun. We were exploring the ideas of what's out in the ocean. Like, we were doing a lot of scientific progress, development, born out of the Renaissances and out of humanism. We were exploring to find answers. And so Bacon says, you know what? We have faculties for certain things. But the human brain also can distract us. We as humans can be distracted from the truth. And so this new instrument that he creates is for distractions from the truth. He calls them idols, I-D-O-L-S. Why does he call them idols? The way I look at it is one of the 10 commandments that they're apparently teaching in Oklahoma or in Alabama, wherever it is that they're teaching them. One of them is that you shall have no God above me, no false idol, I-D-O-L. He uses this differently, of course. Idol here is a distraction from the truth. You're looking to the wrong source for information, an idol. But he says all humans have these. And so we must acknowledge the blinders that we have in order to be able to find truth. So that's the new instrument. To find truth, you have to acknowledge the problems with being human and searching for knowledge and truth. So what are those for? Well, it's pretty simple in your book, I think, but there's the idol of the cave. The idol of the cave is literally, or den, they might use the word den. Either way, picture what they used to call a man cave or a woman's cave or a she shed, right? Like these places that we go where we cut ourselves off from anything we don't want to look at. So my office is my den or my cave. This is where I like to be. I like to have my books. You guys can't see what I have all in here, but I've got pictures on the walls that I love. I've got little knickknacks here and there. I've got a bird cage for some reason with a watch on it. I don't know what I was thinking, but there are things that make me comfortable. And so I stay with them and I keep them close. And I don't want to look at anybody else. So I close the door and I pretend that the world out there is not there, but this little cave of mine, this little den of mine is where I need to be. Well, that limits my ability to see outside of the cave or den, right? And we all have this in our brain. We have certain things that we shut out or don't look at or don't recognize because either we don't agree with it or we don't like it. I think that you all know exactly what I'm talking about when you hear people say you're in your bubble. You're in your little bubble thinking of, or echo chamber. Everybody thinks this is a new concept. It's not. Bacon talked about it a very, very, very long time ago, hundreds of years ago. Okay, so anyway, Bacon then says that that is one of our distractions. So we have to realize that and break out of it if we can. The second is the idol of the tribe. Now, he uses the word tribe. What does he mean by tribe? He means humanity. We are all members of the human tribe. And just being human limits us. For example, eyesight. Some people have better eyesight, some people have worse. We can see things differently, and we need to use instruments to see things better, we think. But our eyes can deceive us. Our eyes can be limited. Studies have been done on men and women assigned sex at birth, and it turns out that women have less peripheral vision and they can see deeper, so we could see more detail in things. But men, they have more peripheral vision and they blur out sort of the detail of everything. So if you've ever wondered why it is that women recognize that we cut a half inch off of our hair and men don't notice if we've chopped all of our hair off, it's because of that. It's because of the focus on peripheral versus detail. And that is part of being in the human tribe. Okay, so we also have limited time. We have limited resources. We have limited ability to find knowledge because of time and because of resources. So that's a limitation. That's an idol that we must break out of to be able to see the other possible answers. Okay. The third one is the idol of the marketplace. All right. What does he mean by marketplace here? Well, in the marketplace, you spend money. You have currency, right? I'm going to give you 3 orens for you to give me that spell or whatever. If you're into The Witcher, you know what I'm talking about. Or here's my $12 to buy whatever item it is that I want. That currency is money. Well, in the human world of knowledge, the currency is language, words. Now, we do have different languages in the world that some of us don't understand. There we go. But what about the relationship between language and objects, language and science, language and the knowledge we're trying to share with others? We have a limited number of words to describe things. We don't have enough words to describe everything the way that we should. And are we defining them properly? Are we seeing things the way we're supposed to be seeing them? And if we do we communicate that? You'll notice that a lot of medical terminology and legal terminology is still in the original Latin. Part of the reason for that is because we couldn't find a word that would translate, literally. They could not find a way to express it. Now we have, for example, stare decisis, which you've probably heard a lot of lately. Stare decisis is the idea that the courts listen to precedent, that they follow precedent. And they now call it precedents and super precedents, right? But sometimes you'll hear lawyers especially call it stare decisis still, because that's completely different from just precedent. It's literally the acknowledgement that what has been is better than what we're looking at right now. And you have to make a decision there, okay? So it's actually a lot more complicated. But yet, we still just say precedents, and we all think we understand. Well, that's a limitation of language. I remember, I can't really speak conversational Spanish. I can understand a little bit of it. And it also depends on what kind of Spanish you're speaking. But one of the things I can do is sing almost all of Ricky Martin's songs that are in Spanish. But I remember I was teaching, this was probably about 2004, and I was up in Minnesota, and I was with a lot of friends who were Latin, and there was a line in Ricky Martin's song, it's called Vuelve, it's not important, but in it he says, I can't remember what the line is exactly, but basically he says, se me falta, I can't remember exactly how it is, but it basically means, when you translate it literally, it's my fault, the air, that you're not here. Like, what the heck does that mean? And I was like, I'm looking, because every translation I did with my little Spanish to English dictionary gave me this language, this line, it's my fault, the air, that you're not here. And so I said to my friends who spoke Spanish as their first language, I said, what is this? And they went, no way to translate that into English. There is no way for me to explain to you that concept in English. And so that's a limitation of language. There's all these limitations on the currency that we use to share knowledge and to share truth, right? There's all of these different linguistic twists and turns that make communicating it we're less able to communicate it. Let's put it that way. The last and fourth idol that we need to pay attention to is the idol of the theater. What is the theater? Well, the theater is as big or as little as it needs to be in the following way. It is your culture, how you were raised, what you were told was the truth, how you think about things based on how you were raised and who was around you. And this, of course, shifts and changes as you move cultures, like co-cultures within, or do they call them subcultures or I think it's co-cultures, co-cultures within that larger culture. And this is, this is notorious. This is how we get situational comedies, is misunderstandings based on these things, right? Now, it's interesting because one would think that a move from Pennsylvania and through a couple states and to Missouri would not make a huge difference in how I think about things. But along the way, these different cultures have impacted me, these co-cultures, if you will, have impacted me, and I've been working on getting my degrees. So I've been trying to gain knowledge as I go. So there's really two things going on that are impacting my way of understanding the world, my way of finding knowledge, my way of seeing truth, that is not just from how I was raised, but based on where I live at the time, what schooling I'm doing, what teachers I have. So none of us have the same exact idol distracting us from the truth, because it's comprised of all of these things over time that have impacted us in the way that we think. Okay, so that's bacon. Hopefully that was clear. Because along comes Giambattista Vico, V-I-C-O, and Vico says to Francis Bacon, he addresses his work to Francis Bacon. He says, hey, wait, let's talk about this, okay? You say that there's these instruments for learning. And by instruments, he was talking about the scientific instruments such as a magnifying glass, or a spyglass, as they used to call it, the telescope, or mathematic measurements that supposedly tell us some new truth. He was talking about those instruments specifically. And he said, I need to explore whether Bacon's way of looking at things or the ancients' way of looking at things gets us closer to truth. So what Vico does is he posits not a theory, but a question. What makes more sense in finding the truth? The way that the ancient Greeks and Romans looked for truth, or the way that we are looking at truth now? Now remember that Bacon said we do have these distractions. And Vico, he's cool with that. But he decides to write out this debate, and it's called On the Study Methods of Our Time, and it's really long. Actually, it's not. It's not that long, but it's long, and you guys are only reading a portion of it. In the portion that you're reading, there is a debate for Vico, and that debate is, what is the better way to find truth? Through our modern methods or through the ancient methods? And he goes through and he explains that in the modern methods, the biggest problem is certainty. We think we know the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth about anything, scientific or philosophical. And he says that can't be. That certainty can't be that certain. So he looks to the ancients, and what did the ancients do? Well, they went through dialectic. They went back and forth. They tested the theories between each other to somehow come to a conclusion. They took stasis and they studied it and they chose which one was most probable. And they say probable, the most likely. Remember, Aristotle never says this is the truth. He says this is the most probable outcome. And Vico says the problem with certainty is if we look for something, we say we are certain that this is what's going on, you stop looking. You stop asking questions, and you stop looking for things that might explain it alternatively. Nowhere is this more clearly seen than in science, medical science specifically. Back in 2009 when I got sick, I had every diagnosis on the planet. I was supposed to die in 3 months because it was lung cancer, or because it was lymphoma that moved into my lungs, or it was some mold that got into my body, or it was some virus that got into my body. And I'm telling you, for about 5 months, doctors would tell me, I'm going to call you next week and tell you what kind of cancer you have and what stage it's at. I had over 7 surgical procedures for biopsying what was going on in my body. And everybody had an answer, but it never really worked out. I mean, I'm still alive, let's start there. But it never was right. And whatever treatment they gave me didn't do anything to the condition I actually had. And each of these doctors stopped when they said, this is what you have. Okay. And I'm telling you, I went through like 30 doctors. I'm not even kidding you. I think it was like 30 different doctors, offices with tests and everything else. And finally it was Mayo Clinic up in Minnesota got a hold of my biopsies, and they figured out what it was. And they said it is this thing called sarcoidosis. Sarcoidosis is an autoimmune disorder. It's not cancer. It's not a virus. It's not genetic. It's not catchable. It's not a mold. It is an autoimmune disease. Okay? So it took them months because none of these doctors, I had one doctor obviously who at some point said, wait a minute, this isn't right, we need to keep going. The lab tests aren't correct, we need to keep going. And so anytime a doctor says, this is what it is, I'm always like, are we sure? Are we sure that what's causing my arthritis is psoriatic arthritis, that it's not sarcoidosis arthritis? Well, you have no signs of sarcoidosis being active, so it's got to be psoriatic. Or it's the fact that I'm 50. Who knows? You know, I went in with a bad shoulder to my generalized doctor, and I said, hey, this shoulder, here's what's happening. And she goes, you know what? You have 50-year-old shoulder. And I was like, fair. And I didn't go any further than that, and within 2 or 3 days it resolved itself. I did a few exercises, she told me, right? If we stop with one thing and say it's this one thing and this one thing only, then we never keep trying to find answers. And so in 2010, when I went to the University of Pittsburgh, they said, here are your 3 options for treatment. There's this level, and this level. You've already worn out this level, so we're going to go to this level, and then there's one more above that. Within a year, I went through all 3 of those, and I was like, crap, I'm dead, right? Like, we're not going to be able to do anything more. Well, during those 3 years, they were still asking the question, how do we treat this disease? So there were 5 more options for me. And that was 15 years ago, right? And at the time that I went into remission, they said, you will live about 10 years after you go into remission. Okay. Well, it's 12 now, so I beat the odds, I guess? No. Things have gotten better and more improved. Why? Because people are still asking questions. We do not believe that we know for certain the answer. We keep looking. It's kind of like cancer, right? Lymphoma was a killer for so long. And now they've got so many treatments and so many options. Why? Because people kept saying, no, we can fix this. We can make it better. We can find more treatments. And the treatment for me that came out to work is a combination of chemotherapy and anti-malarials. Anti-malarials, that's drugs for people who have malaria, okay? And somehow those 2 things working together got me into stage 0. Fantastic, but weird. But what if nobody had thought of that? Because we decided this was the only way to treat it was with steroids. Boom, that's it. That's all you get. We would have been, I'd be dead. And that's honest. But, and a lot of other people would be too. But because we keep asking the question, we get closer to the truth. And that's what Vico ultimately comes to the conclusion of, is that the ancients had it right. They kept asking the question. And if you keep asking the question, you're going to get closer to the truth. And that is why he believed philosophy was so important to understanding reason. Okay? So, today we talked about 3 theorists, Ramus, who decided to take rhetoric and divide it. Basically, make rhetoric just style and delivery, and make reasoning and science everything else. And because of that, we are going to study different people who believe that, yeah, it's just an art. It's just about pretty speaking. It's about lying. It's about creating some feeling. Has nothing to do with the truth or with reason or with science. But we're also going to find people who say it has everything to do with science. And that comes mainly from Vico. Because if Bacon is correct that rhetoric is a skill, and Aristotle's correct that rhetoric is a skill, then the brain has to be involved in that. And the brain does not separate out communicating an idea with the reasoning behind that idea. And so because of that, Vico says, well then, we need to stop pretending like, I'll go with something modern, that these biopsies are going to tell us the absolute truth and we move on. No, we keep looking until we find a better answer, a more probable answer, something that is more likely. I hope that makes sense to you. I hope you understand why it's so important that we study these things. I don't know if you'll get any use out of them necessarily, but I definitely believe they're things that we need to know. So keep reading. I realize that this lecture is very long, but we covered 3 theorists today. I will cover the next 2 on Thursday so that you'll have access to that. And in the meantime, I'm just going to keep grading. So I hope you all have a fantastic little July 4th break if you take one. And I'll see you next week.